going. We got what kind of things are important for controlling blood pressure that your body can deal with. So blood volume, and for long-term control of blood pressure, it's ultimately going to be your blood volume. Again, we talked about how control of blood pressure has a lot to do with your kidneys and your urinary system, which is about water balance. You have here I got the picture I wanted to show. This is just, yeah, hopefully over the weekend you guys were spending some time looking at these parts of your book. The mean arterial blood pressure. Blood volume is ultimately going to be an important thing. These are kind of more of the short-term things that we can work on. Again, we talked about, flow times resistance. Flow, which is cardiac output, if we're looking at the entire system. Resistance, which usually we think about as being adjusted how? In the short term, how do you adjust resistance? Vasoconstriction, vasodilation. And again, as that happens, constriction, resistance goes up, blood pressure is going to go up. Resistance goes down, blood pressure will go down. Again, all else being equal. Resistance is also going to be affected by viscosity we talked about. Part of being dehydrated is also going to make your blood harder to pump, make it more sludgy. Number of red blood cells. We'll talk about erythropoietin, which your body releases to increase the amount of red blood cells if you need to increase the oxygen carrying capacity of your blood. But there are people who will inject erythropoietin as like a performance enhancing drug to try to increase the number of red blood cells, which will work up to a point, unless you get too many, in which case your blood becomes like mud. It's hard to pump. So it's actually, you have to be careful with it. Cardiac output, which is the flow. And again, we talked about a bunch of things. What kind of things affect cardiac output? What's that?
The stroke volume.
The stroke volume. How much is getting pushed out of either ventricle with each beat? And that was affected both by the end diastolic volume, how much blood returns to the heart, and the end systolic volume, which was how much is pumped out at the end of the heartbeat. And that is affected by all sorts of stuff, like your sympathetic activity. You can increase the strength of the contraction, so you have less blood left over and lower end systolic volume. That increase venous return we talked about increases the end diastolic volume, so there is going to be more to pump out. It will increase cardiac output. Again, cardiac output is also determined by your heart rate, which is going to be controlled by your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Anyway, I just pulled this one up. This is just some random thing I pulled up on Google Images. But renin-angiotensin. Let's talk about that briefly. Actually, let's go back here. Cardiac output. We talked about one way to deal with high blood pressure is to try to keep this lower. What kind of drug can work directly both on heart rate and stroke volume? Those beta blockers, those beta adrenergic antagonists. They're going to keep the heart from speeding up by blocking norepinephrine. They'll also keep that from binding, which increases the strength of the contraction. So it'll keep stroke volume from increasing, will also keep the heart rate from increasing. So those are going to be good to keep your blood pressure down. We talked about the renin-angiotensin mechanism. Another major drug was that ACE inhibitor, the angiotensin converting enzyme inhibiting drug. Why is that useful for keeping your blood pressure down?
It'll stop the release of ADH.
Right, so one thing is by blocking formation of angiotensin 2, you then don't have the release of ADH and aldosterone. And why does that help? Aldosterone's not. ADH is a vasoconstrictor. Angiotensin 2 itself is a vasoconstrictor. So both of those are going to work resistance thing more short term.
You keep water in.
Yeah, so that also they keep water. ADH and aldosterone together tell the kidneys to hold on to water, keep your blood volume up. Also, ADH talks to your hypothalamus, makes you thirsty, so you bring more water in. So that renin-angiotensin mechanism is a key player. You do need to make sure that it makes sense. And the other drugs we talked about are just diuretics, things that make you pee more. We'll talk more about their mechanism when we get to the urinary system. Like the loop diuretics work in the loop of Henle by blocking these pumps and changing osmotic gradients. You know, again, osmosis is going to be there at the very end. You know, and yeah, when we go over the lab exam a bit, it's clear there's still a lot of confusion about osmosis on some deep level, because the osmometer question I thought was going to be, I went over it in my little review and stuff, but the majority of people did not nail it. So I want to just go over that once more. Maybe this time it'll start clicking. And that's normal. I mean, when I was doing my undergrad in electrical engineering, we learned all these stability analyses to try to figure out if the system was stable, and these Meckler's plots and stuff. And I was like in 3 semesters deep in it before it's like, oh, that's what the fuck's going on. I could like, so sometimes it takes a while to eventually things can click. All right, blah, blah, blah. Other nuts and bolts. Are there any questions about any of the material we've covered, John?
Part of reducing resistance, this chart we haven't really talked about like shunting. Are some of these things also cut off parts of like the systemic circulation or decrease them? That should lower resistance as well. Like say, not as much blood going to the digestive system.
Right. So we're going to talk about perfusion today. So except for the heart and the brain, you can shut down circulation or adjust it quite a bit. So that does happen. Like if you're bleeding out and you don't have much blood volume left, you're trying to reduce how much, and your spleen will start spasming, trying to like put more blood into circulation rather than have it just getting cleaned in the spleen and stuff. So there is a adjustment of where the blood is flowing to try to deal with stuff as well. Except with the exception of the brain and the heart, which always kind of get their share.
But is that more like life-threatening emergency situation, or is that say?
Yeah, I'd say that's more like if things are not. Normally, you should have that cardiac reserve. You should be able to increase it 5 times if you need to. Because normally, if you're just sitting on your butts right now, about 90% of the capillaries in your muscles are shut off. You can increase the amount of blood flowing into the muscle tissue by 10 times if you are starting to use them. And that's going to happen. Hopefully you have enough blood and you just start pushing it through like 5 times faster to deliver way more oxygen and get it into everything and keep the blood pressure up. Other thing I wanted to say, I saw some people, a few people ended up getting books that are not the official books that we were trying to use. If you are running out, these are only $13 including shipping. So it's This is like, especially like in Marin, this is just like a burrito these days. So just to let you know, if you, usually there's enough room, but sometimes people run out of space. If you're running out of space, we have a few labs left. Cardiovascular labs, respiratory labs, urinary labs, digestive labs. So I saw some people seem to be getting near the end, so I just thought I would just stop there. And again, it's the one, it's just quad, it's numbered, single-sided. So some people have been getting these things that have like carbon copies and things like that. You don't need any of that. And that makes it way less compact. Okay. So just reminders what we're going to be doing later today. So let me just review this super briefly. Okay. Mean arterial pressure. Does anyone remember the formula to calculate mean arterial pressure based on the systolic and diastolic?
Is it diastolic plus 1/3 times diastolic minus systolic?
Close. Think about which one's higher, systolic or diastolic.
Oh, systolic minus diastolic.
Yeah, so it's going to be, you take that difference, systolic minus diastolic times 1/3, and then add it to the diastolic, and then you end up, that's the mean arterial pressure. Again, which is not, it's a little lower than the midpoint because it's an asymmetrical thing. We spend more time down near the lower than the higher pressure. What's keeping the pressure from dropping to 0 during the diastolic pressure? Yeah. Yeah, those large elastic arteries like the aorta and the pulmonary arteries stretch out during systole, and then they kind of compress and keep propelling the blood during diastole. Again, that is also what is responsible for that isovolumetric contraction when we start ventricular systole, and where the ventricle starts squeezing, building up pressure in the ventricle, but no blood actually ejects, no blood actually leaves the heart until you actually are greater than the diastolic pressure and are able to overcome that on the other side of the semilunar valves and get out of the heart. We're going to see in our lab today some interesting things about systolic pressure versus diastolic pressure, like during exercise, and how they change. And they don't necessarily change symmetrically. And if you think about it, increasing systolic pressure, that's going to increase flow. But increasing diastolic pressure is more about increasing how hard the heart has to squeeze before you ever actually get blood to leave the heart even. So high diastolic pressure is not such a great thing because it means that the heart has to work harder and harder just to even get blood to leave. It's not actually helping the heart push the blood harder out everywhere. It's actually it's fighting the heart ejecting blood. Again, this little doohickey, the dicrotic notch I mentioned, is just that little back pressure when the semilunar valves slam shut. As diastole starts and the pressure drops in the ventricle, and then the blood tries to come back into the heart, and the semilunar valve slams shut, so it can't, but there's this little hiccup of back pressure that causes that little notch. It's just kind of a classic looking thing. Okay. And I just, yeah, and again, there's no warm up because we actually have our quiz coming up before lab, so I figured it'd be kind of silly to do a warm up and quiz is like a warm up. Okay. What do I have here? So we've been talking about kind of big picture control of your mean arterial pressure, which is dependent on the cardiac output, the flow leaving your heart, times the total resistance of your vessels. What we're going to do now is talk about more local autoregulation. Right, there's that big picture of just keeping your blood pressure controlled, but then there's also just local stuff that is happening, like, oh, the tissue in my finger is a little low in oxygen and needs more blood. There are a lot of controls that are happening locally that are not being controlled by a whole big system that help make sure that you have adequate perfusion, oxygenated blood going into the different tissues. So let's talk about local autoregulation. All right, so now instead of thinking about this big picture, we're just thinking about, oh, we're looking there in your toe or in your leg or in your hand or your arm or wherever. Flow, going to be some pressure, resistance. Right, so if I have some area where I want to kind of increase the flow into that region, let's assume that the pressure is what it is. The pressure has kind of been set by the big system. And I want to have some more flow going into some area that is low in oxygen. And I've got my cells here. Got blood vessels kind of coming in. And they're sensing there's low oxygen or maybe high carbon dioxide in this region. What could happen to help increase the flow to let more blood in to supply this area?
Dilate the blood vessels.
Exactly. We're going to have vasodilation. So this is just happening automatically. This is not like a big, control thing. This is like just these vessels can detect low oxygen, high carbon dioxide, and will ultimately dilate and increase the flow into that region. You get the opposite as well. Vasoconstriction, if there's plenty of oxygen in the region, then that's not where we want to be sending the blood because it's a waste. We should mention this is the systemic side. What about the pulmonary circuit? We're going to have a similar local autoregulation system going, do you think? That would make as much sense because it's going through to the lungs. It's about to get super oxygenated no matter what. Yeah, this does not make sense for the lungs because what's the point of sending blood to the lungs? To pick up oxygen. So if there is not much oxygen there, you don't want to increase blood flow to that region where there's no oxygen to pick up. That's silly. In fact, if there's lots of oxygen, that's where you want to send the blood right? So it's going to basically be the opposite. Right, John?
Sorry if I missed this, but on the systemic side, does that happen? Arteries, arterioles, capillaries?
Yeah, like the little arterioles.
So they all have these little receptors within the walls.
Or there are, yeah, so actually the vessels themselves, I think, sometimes release like nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator. I'm not sure about all of the mechanisms. Mainly, I know that it does happen.
But you wouldn't see it in the veins. Or you would not see it in the veins on the systemic side.
No, it wouldn't make sense there. Yeah, because that's not about delivering the blood in there. Another kind of cool thing about local autoregulation. Normally, we would have spent a little more time talking about smooth muscle. So I need to give you a little teaser about smooth muscle. Just like we had the kind of teaser about cardiac muscle. So smooth muscle can be triggered to contract in many different ways, as opposed to skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is only triggered by the somatic motor neurons. Smooth muscle can be triggered by autonomic motor neurons, but it can also be triggered by hormones. It can be triggered by stretch. I'll give you what, so I'll say it. So autonomic motor neuron, that makes sense. That's just controlling the smooth muscle with the autonomic motor. Shouldn't be surprising. We talked about how epinephrine, adrenaline, can like cause your bronchial passages to dilate or this or that. So hormones can control the contraction of smooth muscle. And the last one is stretch. Stretch meaning just by stretching it out, it will automatically squeeze back at you. Like if this wall was made out of smooth muscle, back. If I squeezed here and pushed it, it would squeeze back and push at me. So basically by stretching it out, you cause it to squeeze back at you. So what that means in terms of local autoregulation of blood flow is we have our blood vessels, smooth muscle in the wall. So we're going to come back to this here. We've just been talking about how the pressure is going up and down, up and down. Systolic, diastolic. Even when you get to the smaller vessels, the pressure is lower than that 120/80 because you lose pressure as you get to the smaller and smaller and smaller little vessels. But it's still going up and down, up and down. But it turns out because of this property of smooth muscle, it helps kind of smooth out the flow. Even though the pressure is going up and down, the flow stays relatively constant. Think about it. Pressure goes up. Pressure goes up, meaning that you're pushing harder against the vessel wall, you're stretching it out more. But if you stretch it, you trigger it to contract, which means it gets smaller, which means the resistance is going up. So if the pressure goes up, the resistance goes up. So now later, now the pressure's going down. That means, oh, we're not stretching it. It relaxes more. When it relaxes and dilates, the resistance goes down. So this basically evens out the flow. Yet despite rising and falling blood pressure. Does that make sense?
So
Bonnie?
is it then kind of similar thinking to the Frank Starling, the same, or is that different?
It's different. I mean, that one is also kind of coordinated by the properties of cardiac muscle due to pre-stretch. This is a little different. But you know, it's in the same like barn or whatever. All right, so that all makes sense. So this is local autoregulation. This is not, you know, most of everything we've been talking about up to this point has been in a big picture control of mean arterial pressure. This is just kind of looking at one little part of the body and seeing how the blood flow is affected. Okay. Perfusion. Let me. This is just like how much of your cardiac output is being channeled into one or another part of your body. And always, these numbers are always ridiculous. It's obviously going to depend on the person, but I'll write it right. Brain, 13%. So your brain, even though your brain is only 3 pounds out of your entire body, it's getting 13% of your blood flow because your CNS neurons are incredibly metabolically hungry. Your brain uses a lot of energy to keep going. And your brain is really intolerant of ischemia. Ischemia is if there's not enough oxygen coming in. Right, if you fall asleep on your arm and you block off all the circulation, it's like, you know, and you do it for 10 minutes, it's like, oh my God, my arm's asleep. Okay, I don't even feel it. Oh my God, the pins and needles, oh, stop. And then it's okay, it works. You know, if somebody strangles you for 10 minutes, you're dead, right? You know, you can put a tourniquet on your arm for 10 minutes and it's not going to be any long-term problem. You put a tourniquet around your neck, there's a long-term problem. Your neurons tend to just go into these programmed cell death modes when the oxygen drops for too long, just to try to minimize the damage to the rest of the cells if they die uncontrolled. But so in general, if your brain is not getting enough oxygen, it's bad. So your brain is getting lots of blood, and typically what John was talking about, like changing the amount of blood flow depending on your body's needs, the brain is always going to get what it needs though, because it doesn't really do well with cutting back its supply. The only things I've heard, like there's some things of really lowering the body temperature super low, like kids that have like fallen to the bottom of a super cold lake for 20 minutes and then they can get revived. Or when people have like weird brain things going on, they'll like make them incredibly hypothermic. I think it limits the kind of damage to the brain until they can kind of try to stabilize things. So I think when you're super cold, way below body temperature, there are some exceptions to the rule that you're going to be dead if your brain doesn't get oxygen for 5 minutes, but in general, it needs it. Heart. Also, if you're 4%. How does the heart get its blood? What are the main arteries that bring the blood to the heart muscle itself? So the veins return the blood to the heart for being pumped, but I'm talking more about the oxygenated blood to actually supply the heart muscle, which needs to be actively getting oxygen so it can do the actual squeezing. The coronary artery. So we talked about the coronary circulation, which is left and right coronary arteries that supply the heart muscle itself. They're basically tapped right off the base of the aorta. Yeah, it's a heart attack, is if you are not getting adequate flow to the cardiac muscle itself to keep the heart muscle happy with the oxygen it needs. So the rest of so these tend to not be adjusted very much because there's not much room for adjustment. The brain needs its oxygen, the heart needs its oxygen. If the heart isn't doing its job, everything else is going to be, that'd be bad for everything if the heart is something. Abdominal organs. I have here like 24%. Obviously, this can vary a lot depending on your body's needs. Again, parasympathetic will increase a lot of the activity here towards the digestive viscera, whereas you'll have parasympathetic will decrease it. I have here skeletal muscles, 20%. This can change dramatically. At rest, only 10% of the capillary beds are open. We'll talk more about capillary beds in a few moments, but basically that's, you already know capillaries. That's where you actually have the exchange between the blood and the tissue. So you have a huge capacity to increase the blood flow into your muscles if your muscles are working harder. Kidneys. Okay. So this, you're going to have to store this in the back of your mind. Kidneys, around 20%. So this one, your kidneys are about the size of a bar of soap sitting here in your lower back. They obviously don't need, and in fact, it can be 20 to 25%. You obviously don't need a quarter of your cardiac output going to your kidneys just for your kidneys to have the oxygen and nutrients they need. This is going to be about the processing of your blood, about water balance, salt balance, getting rid of wastes and things. We'll talk about the urinary system in lots of detail, but this is going to be an important starting point. So we look at the function of the kidneys is somewhere between a fifth to a quarter of your cardiac output is going actually into your kidneys rather than going to any tissue that needs oxygen or something. So I think that's, so when we talk about kidney function, this will come back and be important. What else do I got here? Oh, skin. Just so your skin can change the amount of blood flow up to 50 times more or less. And this is going to be about temperature control. You're trying to cool down, you're going to route more of your blood to the surface of your skin where you can radiate off more heat. You're trying to conserve temperature, conserve heat, you're going to close those off and you're going to keep the blood closer to your core so you don't lose that heat. What do I want to say? Oh, when we're talking about the brain, syncope,
Fainting?
fainting. So when people have the mean arterial pressure drops below about 60, that's when you can get people fainting. So kidneys will also fail if your blood pressure gets too low, right? Because they need adequate blood flow, and we're going to see high enough pressure to create the filtrate. So part of the problem of low blood pressure can be like kidney failure as well. But let's talk about shock. So shock, in a medical sense, it's when you have inadequate oxygenated blood perfusing your tissues. That's what shock means in the context of this class. And it can happen in a few different ways. You can have hypovolemic shock, meaning there's not enough blood volume to keep the blood flowing to all your tissues. You've just been hemorrhaging really bad. Have cardiogenic shock. The heart is not doing its job to generate the pressure and pump the blood around. So that can cause shock, inadequate perfusion of your tissues. And then vascular shock, where your vessels, for instance, anaphylaxis is where all your vessels are dilating, your blood pressure is going to if all your vessels dilate and the resistance just drops really low. If the resistance drops really low, your blood pressure is going to drop really low, and you're not going to be sending the blood where it needs to go. So there's different ways you can get shock. Like I said, it's because you don't have enough blood left, or your heart isn't pushing the blood out, or your vessels have lost their tone and we no longer have the peripheral resistance that was necessary to keep the blood pressure up. So that's the basic idea of what shock is. Let's see. Let's go into the vessels. We'll do this just kind of briefly. And then we'll talk about the blood. Then we're almost done. Once we're done with the cardiovascular system, we can loop back and finish up the muscles, because remember we all started the muscles and then kind of did the cardiovascular to make sure we've got the background for the labs. Then we'll get the respiratory system done, and then you'll have your vacation day, and then come back for another exam.
Yay.
Yeah. We have a Veterans Day on Thursday.
I know my kid has it off too, but they didn't see what school Friday. What a waste of it. I think all school districts do.
Yeah, Veterans Day is a pretty
They don't.
common holiday. Yeah.
Did you get Monday out? Your kids get Monday out? Mine did. Yeah, mine got home to stay home yesterday. Nevada didn't have school.
Okay, so I think we pretty much did the heart. We've done kind of the big picture. We're going to now go to blood vessels. In general, blood vessels have their lumen, which is just the space, the hollow space in between any hollow organ. They're always lined with what kind of tissue?
Simple squamous.
They're lined with endothelium. Just simple squamous epithelium. This is sometimes also called the tunica intima. So it's kind of used as a synonym. Like if you're reading about cardiovascular stuff or blood vessels, sometimes they'll say intima, sometimes they'll say endothelium. They're just this, it's the same thing. It's interchangeable. They're both used quite a bit when you're just reading stuff about this. The main wall of the vessel is called the tunica media. It's the middle tunic. A smooth muscle. So smooth muscle, so you can adjust the diameter. Again, in general, controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. And then the elastic fibers to kind of give it stretchiness and springiness. The muscle is only to adjust diameter. It's not to actually propel the blood or generate the pressure that's moving the blood. Right, so that's important to remember, actually. Like the heart muscle is generating your blood pressure. The smooth muscle in here, even though it's in the vessels, is just about adjusting diameter and therefore resistance. So you know, the outside, it doesn't mean, you know, tunica externa or adventitia. Don't worry about that. There are 3 main kinds of vessels that we will talk about, and then subtypes of those. Arteries, veins, capillaries. Arteries and veins have this basic structure. The capillaries are basically, you know, just by the time we get to the capillaries, it's just the super thin, simple squamous epithelium. We don't have these other layers, but these other dudes have all those layers. By definition, so far we've introduced arteries and veins. What's the big difference between arteries and veins?
Arteries go away from the heart and veins bring it back.
Arteries, these leave the heart. These return to the heart. And obviously, if you are leaving the heart, you're basically at the source that's generating the blood pressure. These are going to have to deal with much higher pressures than the veins are. The veins are after the blood. In fact, when we look at this in more detail in a few moments, by the time we get into the smallest little arterioles, it's kind of into the capillary beds. The little venules. Even by the time we're down at the smallest little branches, instead of being at like a mean arterial pressure of like, you know, 90 or whatever, which never we calculated the last time, like 120 over 80 was like 93. By the time you get down here, it's about 40 millimeters of mercury. By the time you get to the other side here, it's only 20 millimeters of mercury. So the blood that is coming out of the backside of the capillary beds, starting to head back to the heart, is starting with a pressure of only 20 millimeters of mercury. So much lower pressure, whereas these arteries that are leaving the heart are dealing with like, mean arterial pressures 90 and above. So that's going to define a lot of the anatomical differences based on that. Like if I am trying to maintain my diameter under really high pressures, what is that going to say about the smooth muscle that I'm going to need? Yes, it has to be stronger, it's to be thicker. This is going to have much thicker tunica media. You need a lot more smooth muscle to hold your shape under the high pressure. If you are in a vein, you can have much thinner tunica media because there's not much pressure you're fighting. Again, if you've been in anatomy, you've probably seen this already. Like arteries look kind of like little rubber hoses. They actually stay open even if there's nothing in there because they've got all that smooth muscle in the wall. A vein is this floppy thing. Sometimes you don't even know it's a tube until you hold it and roll it and realize, oh, it's like this super thin walled floppy tube. If I have stuff flowing under really low pressure, what's some way I could help keep the flow going? So let's say the pressure is really low. I want to make sure the flow keeps moving.
Increase resistance.
Decrease the resistance, right? If I have low pressure, I want lower resistance. How can I have lower resistance? Vasodilate. Or just in general, anatomically, just have a larger diameter to start with as well. So these veins tend to be larger in diameter, which means there's less resistance, which means even under lower pressure, you're still more likely to have blood flow. Okay. The arteries, I've already kind of talked about these two different main kinds, but I'll mention again. They're like the elastic arteries. These are like directly linking the heart. The aorta, etc. These ones are big rubbery tubes. And their job is to make sure that the diastolic pressure stays high. In the aorta, it really does just look like a big rubbery garden hose. Most of your arteries are what we call muscular arteries. Your brachial artery, your radial artery, your femoral artery, all those, most of the named arteries are muscular arteries. Their tunica media is mostly smooth muscle, just to adjust the diameter and therefore adjust your blood pressure as well as like where the flow goes and stuff like that. When arteries get small enough, they're then called arterioles. What diameter depends what book you're reading. It's usually somewhere around 1/3 of a millimeter. Veins. Let's talk a little more about veins. The big trick for veins is make sure the blood actually does return to the heart, even though we are starting with such a low pressure to start with. And down at maybe at your feet, they've got to come up all the way to your heart. There probably isn't actually enough pressure to do it on its own. So there's a number of things going on that help the blood moving through the veins so it actually does return to the heart. What are some of the tricks that veins have up their sleeve?
They have are they called valves?
Yeah, so they all have little one-way valves. this was a. So once, you've probably done that. Like if I try to push the blood away from my heart, you can actually see the little valves start tapping out on my veins because the blood's trying to move down to my hand, but it can't. And the veins are blowing up and you can see these little knots where the valves are getting stuck. Whereas if I go this way, everything just flattens out because the blood just wants to go that way. So veins all have little one-way valves that lead back to your heart. Right, if you're giving someone a massage, it feels a lot better to stroke their arm that way than go this way and pop out all their veins. So that's one way the blood keeps going. If it manages to get part of the way, there's something at the door, then the one-way valves, what else do the veins have going for them to help the blood return to the heart?
Don't they also constrict?
What is
We're
that?
talking about that they constrict or something to help like.
So that was what I was trying to say here. They adjust diameter resistance, but they're not about propelling the blood.
We're talking about synthetic innovation or
So there is, you can have the increased venous return by decreasing the overall volume of blood in the veins, but it's still not really about pumping the blood or roots. That's more just about reducing the space for it so that the pressure scooshes more of it back to the heart. It's your skeletal muscles that are actually the ones that are helping pump the blood. So you have skeletal muscles, like your biceps, your triceps, your quadriceps, whatever. This is not smooth muscle. This is skeletal muscle that is surrounding the veins. And as it contracts and relaxes, it's basically going to massage. Like if I have some blood there, and then the skeletal muscle squeezes, it splooshes into here. Because of the one-way valves, it's now further back to the heart and can't get back where it was. So there's this massage by skeletal muscle that helps keep the blood moving back to the heart. Another thing, we're going to talk about in much more detail when we do the respiratory system, but I know you've seen in your Bio 110, what drives pulmonary ventilation? The breathing, pulling air into your lungs and expelling air from your lungs.
Diaphragm.
Yeah, so the diaphragm is contracting, relaxing, and what is that doing?
creates a negative pressure.
It's creating that negative pressure zone in your thoracic cavity, which is driving the bulk flow of the air in and out of your lungs. So that's where all of your vena cava is coming back into your heart and everything, and your atria that are receiving it are in this zone that's all of a sudden periodically becoming negative pressure, low pressure. So we call this the respiratory pump, because having those veins and atria in that zone, which is just dropping down and back up, is actually driving the blood back into the heart as well. So we have one-way valves, massaged by skeletal muscle, and what we call the respiratory pump, which is just the term we use to describe these pressure changes in the thoracic cavity as you're breathing, that in addition to driving the movement of air in and out of your lungs, actually helps serve to drive the flow of blood back to your heart. By the time the blood makes it back to the vena cava, it's usually about 0 millimeters of mercury left. It basically gets back to the heart, with almost no pressure left. All right. Capillaries. Let's talk a little bit more about capillaries. Capillaries, mainly tunica intima. You don't have any of the muscle left or anything. It's basically the thinnest kind of wall you can make using the building block of a human body, the simple squamous epithelium. Minimize the distance that the oxygen has to diffuse. There are 3 kinds of capillaries. These are kind of your classic capillaries that we think about. And these are going to be the site of exchange with the blood. So we'll talk about these in more detail in just a few moments, since they're the most common. I should mention they are really small. So these are just tunica intima. And they tend to be around 8 to 10 microns in diameter, which is basically the size of a red blood cell. So red blood cells are basically going through the capillary single file, which is meaning it's going to minimize the distance that oxygen has to diffuse, which is carried on the red blood cell to get out into the tissue. So the blood going through the capillaries, the cells are literally going through single file through these little things. And slow enough that that there's time for diffusion to happen. Another kind of capillary that you've actually met briefly, the fenestrated capillary. So fenestrated means means having windows. So these are super leaky. They have these special little pores that make them particularly useful to either absorb more stuff, like these would be in your digestive organs to absorb nutrients, or also to leak out, to create filtrate. If you have high pressure in a fenestrated capillary, you'll have liquid like plasma leaking out. When we talked about the choroid plexuses making your CSF being little leaky capillaries, they are versions of these fenestrated capillaries. When we look at the glomerulus in the nephron, the start of the processing in your kidney, those are going to be fenestrated capillaries that are letting the water and solutes leak out of your blood for processing. So fenestrated capillaries can either be to let stuff leak out of the blood for different reasons, or also to really absorb stuff. Well, endocrine glands, we have to just absorb hormones and bring them into the blood. You want to make it really easy for stuff to get into the bloodstream. And then 3, I'll say sinusoidal capillaries. So these are capillaries that are have incomplete walls. You find them like in the liver, in the spleen, the bone marrow. This is where you actually have to kind of go in, like in the liver, you literally have these white blood cells that reach in and help clean stuff out of your blood. Recycle red blood cells that are worn out, or get rid of other stuff. In your bone marrow, you have your megakaryocytes pinching off little platelets into the bloodstream. You know, basically, it's a place where blood can be processed, where things can reach in and kind of mess around in there. Stuff, they're usually very twisty, so the blood really slows down, so the processing can happen. And we'll talk about the liver in more detail later, but you know, a big part of what the liver does is basically cleaning up your blood. It's recycling worn out red blood cells, for instance. Same as the spleen. So if you want to go in and kind of do maintenance on the blood, you need to have this place where the blood's kind of slowing down, where you can kind of reach in and do things. So sinusoidal capillaries, very specialized, only found in as far as I know, I think these are the 3 places you find them, but they're super important for what they do. All right, so what we're going to do now is look a little more here at continuous capillaries, the most common capillaries. We'll talk a little bit more about the behavior of these capillary beds. Arterial. Like I said, pressure coming in is usually already down to about 40 millimeters of mercury, because again, you're just getting into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller vessels and more resistance. Again, we have our cells, right? The body cells are all around. These are actually so capillaries in general, even if they're continuous capillaries, if they're not fenestrated or super leaky, but in general, capillaries have to be pretty leaky, because their whole point is to let things in and out. And the whole point is where things can go back and forth between the tissues and the blood. Where's the one place we've talked about where they actually are not very leaky at all? They're super tightly controlled. See that?
The blood-brain barrier.
And that blood-brain barrier, that's one place where it's pretty different. We'll also, at the very end of the semester, we'll see the blood-testis barrier as well. But in general, it's going to be important as we talk about this to remember, okay, they're kind of leaky. Because what's going to happen as blood enters into the capillary bed, you're actually going to have fluid leaking out. So fluid leaks out due to hydrostatic pressure. It's going to leave the blood, the capillaries, and get into the tissue space, the space between the cells. Actually, while we're here, let me add one little more piece here. before the blood actually gets into the capillary bed, we have to have this little pre-capillary sphincter relax, right? Because your tissue is going to have different needs depending on its metabolic activity in the moment. Like I said, with muscles, like at rest, about 90% of your capillary beds are not open. These little pre-capillary sphincters stay closed because we don't need all that blood going through the tissue. Now, this is just a little circle of smooth muscle that can adjust the entrance, basically gate the entrance into this capillary bed. Even when it's open, it doesn't just stay open. It opens and closes and opens and closes and opens and closes and opens and closes with pulses. I think it's probably just to be kind of like to give the blood a little like nudge. Remember I was saying the blood is literally going through one cell at a time. I think it's kind of like, you know, if you have a salt shaker, you kind of keep hitting it, jostle the little grains to keep it coming out of the little holes and stuff. But so it's not just open smoothly, it's open, close, to kind of keep imagine these things. This meta-arterial is just there, so there is some minimal flow from the arterial side to the venous side, even if the capillary bed is closed, right? The blood doesn't just hit here and get stuck. There's still some flow. We'll talk about why being stuck is really bad. It's basically going to increase the chance of some kind of a thrombus. If the blood is just sitting around without having a place to go, you're more likely to get some little clot forming, which we did talk about that a bit with like AFib. So the blood is minimally flowing, but if the capillary bed is open, the pre-capillary sphincter relaxes, then you get a lot of blood going through here. So fluid leaving the blood into the tissue spaces. Fortunately, most of that is going to come back. Why is the fluid going to return as we go to the far end of the capillary bed? What's happening to the osmolarity of the blood as the water's leaving here? Decreasing. It's increasing, right? Right. The blood is losing water, which means we have more solutes left over, which means higher osmolarity. So all of a sudden we've got higher osmolarity here and actually lower hydrostatic pushing out. So that means we're going to actually having the water suck back up into the bloodstream here. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Could you explain why the hydrostatic pressure is different from one side to the other?
It's just because you're going through these tiny little tubes and you're losing pressure just due to the friction and stuff going through the wall. Right, like think about if you had a really tiny little tube and you were trying to blow through it as hard as you can, it's still gonna not be that much pressure on the other side. So this is happening constantly. As the blood enters the capillary beds, fluid leaks out into the spaces between the cells, but then most of it gets sucked back in to then return to the heart and stay part of your blood. But there is a net loss. 3 liters per day of fluid. So every day, about 3 liters of water is leaving your bloodstream, just getting into the spaces between the cells. Right. If you didn't have a way to deal with this, 2 things. One is your blood would become sludge really quick. And also you'd have all this fluid forming in the spaces in between the cells. There is normally some interstitial fluid, but if you have excess, what do we call it when you have too much fluid in between the cells? Edema, that's that lymphedema. So we need to recover this fluid and pour it back into the bloodstream so our blood doesn't turn to mud and so we don't just become all bloated with edema. What is the system that's going to do that? Lymphatic system. So in addition to all of your normal capillaries, we also have a bunch of lymph capillaries permeating all your tissues. For whatever reason, they're always drawn in green. The lymphatic system and the lymph vessels are almost always drawn in green. Lymph is not green. Lymph is kind of like it's basically any of this fluid and any of the dissolved proteins or whatever else is just what the lymph is. This is what we call lymph. It's just the fluid that's in between the cells and any dissolved stuff in it. And we need to collect it. So we're going to have lymph capillaries. So these lymph capillaries and absorb this leaked fluid as well as any kind of thing floating around. They actually have these kind of their endothelium can kind of open up and close back. So there's like little endothelial flaps. Those endothelial flaps let bigger things like little proteins or whatever, even cells can enter into the lymphatic capillary. And so these things are all collecting this leaked fluid and any other things floating around in the space between the cells. And then they ultimately all join up into the system of lymph vessels, which I'll just draw on the other board. All over your body, you've got the little lymph capillaries. They all join into these larger vessels, these lymph vessels. And they're ultimately going to dump back into it's kind of right near the vena cava, like near the brachiocephalic vein. So basically, we have, here's our heart. Here's like the superior vena cava and brachiocephalic veins. Just going to dump back in. So all of that fluid that was collected up is just going to join back into your bloodstream here and become part of your blood again, which is kind of what you want. In that process, it also gets that lymph again, which is just all of that fluid and other stuff, gets kind of cleaned and filtered by lymphatic tissue. So let's talk about that briefly. So lymphatic tissue is part of your immune system. It is different kinds of white blood cells, lymphocytes, and macrophages. It's found in a variety of places. I'll introduce it right now in the lymph nodes, and then we'll talk a few more places you find it. Lymphocytes and macrophages we'll talk about in much more detail when we get to the immune system. So for right now, you could just think about them as major players in your immune system, but we'll be spending a lot of time looking in detail about lymphocytes and macrophages. So right now, just think about them as your immune system, white blood cells. So lymph nodes. As the blood is moving, as the lymph is moving back, it's going to get processed by this lymphatic tissue again. That's called lymphoid. So the lymph is coming back, and as it's on its way back, it goes through these lymph nodes, which have all these white blood cells, which can clean things out, as well as we'll see later, do parts of adaptive specific immunity. But so as the lymph makes its way back into the bloodstream, it's kind of cleaned and filtered. These lymph nodes are about the size of a little bean, and they're all over your body. Some of the major collections of lymph nodes are, they're all over, but some of the major ones are called cervical in your neck, axillary under your arm, inguinal in your groin. You know, when people talk about swollen glands, right, you feel by the neck and somebody, you know, somebody's fighting something because their glands are swollen. It's actually the lymph nodes that are clustered around the neck that are having a lot of activity where the lymphocytes are dividing and making lots of antibodies to fight the infection. So when those lymph nodes are actively fighting infections, you get a lot of cell multiplication of the lymphocytes, which makes the swollen glands, the swollen lymph nodes. Again, the word gland is kind of a bad word, but that's what people say swollen glands, but it's actually swollen lymph nodes. Again, we'll talk much more about lymphocytes and why lymphocytes are going to start dividing in response to an infection in a little bit. I don't know, another week, couple of weeks. So this lymphatic tissue, obviously it's here. It's also found lots of other places. It's found almost any place where there's some boundary between the outside world and the inside world, like lining along your trachea, lining along your digestive tract. In fact, I'll just give you this special nerve. The malt. Mucosa associated lymphatic tissue or lymphoid tissue. Right, so you've got your throat, your trachea, and your stomach and your intestines and all this stuff. So there are all these access points, these tubes running through you, either down your intestines or your trachea or whatever, where some little germ can, ooh, I can cross the mucosal boundary and get into this body and go set up camp. But you're going to run into lymphoid tissue most of the time. You have lymphoid tissue just lining around the back of your throat. What do we call the little packs of lymphoid tissue, white blood cells right underneath the skin on the back of your throat? The tonsils. The tonsils are part of this mucosal lymphoid tissue. It's all kind of along the walls of your intestines. In particular, in the ileum part of your small intestine, you have major patches of it. People from anatomy remember that lymphoid tissue that is in great abundance right inside the wall of the ileum. Anybody remember? Something like that. Way down yonder in the. Did people sing that little song? The Pyre's Patches.
Oh,
Any pocket. All right, the Pyre's patches are another part of this lymphoid tissue here. But it's all over. It's also random. It's if you just get a slide of the trachea, you'll see lymphoid tissue there. So just kind of giving you a sense. Lymphoid tissue is not just in a lymph node. The one other place that we find it that we should, it'll be a good stopping point. Let's talk about the spleen. So the spleen, it's sitting up in your very upper left-hand part of your abdominal cavity. And it's kind of like a big lymph node, but for blood. Don't say like a big lymph node. Blood. So basically, you're going to have a splenic artery leading into it, splenic vein leaving it, and then the spleen itself is going to have lots of lymphoid tissue. And sinusoidal capillaries where the blood is getting processed. Basically, the blood comes in and there are all these white blood cells that are processing. Again, sometimes they talk about it as the RBC graveyard, like where the red blood cells go to die after they've spent like their 4 months on, on the front lines doing their thing. So it's recycling old red blood cells. And it can store stuff like platelets get stored in there. It can act as a reservoir for blood if you're hemorrhaging really bad and your blood volume is going down. The spleen can just contract and spasm and push this blood that's normally just been kind of hanging out there getting processed and push it into your circulation to try to keep your blood volume up. So it can act as a little reservoir. Your spleen isn't absolutely necessary. People lose their spleens in accidents. I've had students who don't have spleens and have crazy scars. They had to, and they do fine. It's not like the liver. If you don't have a liver, you're dead. If you don't have a heart, you're dead. But if you don't have a spleen, in fact, the liver is doing a lot of the stuff that the spleen does in terms of filtering and cleaning your blood and recycling worn out blood cells and things like that. So the spleen, it's nice to have a spleen, but if you don't got a spleen, you'll get by fine. that being said, this whole lymphatic system, but we'll close it with just some pictures. One of, I think it's probably not more, but one of the textbooks many years ago, and it started the chapter on the lymphatic system, talking about the lymphatic system is not a superstar, you know, because all these other systems get all this cardiovascular system with the heart pumping your blood, and it's like, the fact is though, you are so happy you have a lymph system. I'll show you some pictures which I think are useful when the lymphatic system is not working well. Well, I should mention, I'll mention a little bit. So there is a disease where these little parasitic worms come in and scar up the lymphatic vessels, so you don't get that drainage, which means the fluid just keeps building up in the tissues without draining. So I'll show you some horrible pictures.
Oh, shit.
But you can see what's happening
God, that's
to
so gross.
if the tissue just keeps getting the fluid going between the cells, interstitial fluid, but it's not draining with the lymphatic, it's just everything blows up.
How do you treat that?
I think. Yeah, so just, right, it's bad.
So it's the legs in particular?
No, it can be anywhere. These pictures are legs. Here, if you want to see this, there's horrible pictures where the testes, so the scrotal sac, where people literally have to carry their scrotum around in a wheelbarrow, right? So just the fluid, right? So it's not just the legs.
You should be able to like drain that
So
or
it's
something.
different from
Ooh.
lymphedema because it looks kind of similar.
So it is. So how can you tell if somebody has, you can have, this is crazy, like kind of taken to extreme, but what about if you have congestive heart failure even, you can start having edema because that excess pressure is creating more fluid leaving the vessels than can return normally. What is the difference if someone has lymphedema? How do you know they have lymphedema? You know, arm is kind of big and that they're not just obese.
You press down on it, it stays depressed.
Yeah, it's like if somebody is just kind of got adipose, it's springy. You push and it springs back. If they have lymphedema, it's more like, reminds me of like one of those like Tempur-Pedic memory foam beds or something. You push and you basically squeeze the water out and then you let go and it takes a while for it to kind of fill back up. So let me see, or let's do pitting edema. This will be fun. If you've ever, yeah.
Ooh.
Right, you push and then you let go and it stays. Yeah, here's more of them, right? So if this was fat, when you took your finger away, it would just spring back. But because it's fluid that is in between the cells, it gets kind of pushed out and it takes a little, it'll come back, but it's more like that, again, like a Tempur-Pedic mattress. You can have fun, get multiple fingerprints on their feet if you're willing to play. No, it is, I had, yeah, if I don't know, have people experienced this before?
Yeah, I'm actually a caretaker for this little old lady, and she has edema all in her lower extremities, and the doctors can't figure out why she has it. And she's put on 40 pounds of just fluid. pretty
Right,
crazy.
so I think they often give like diuretics to kind of lead more, but I don't, yeah, it is, so this is one of the reasons, another reason why you want to have good drainage of your lymph. What is-
They use the socks too.
Yeah, the
Oh, yeah.
compression socks and things like that.
If she goes to like a lymphedemic clinic 2 or 3 times a week and they like massage all of her lymph nodes and try to.
Right, so so that is one thing we haven't really mentioned is what is actually keeping the lymph moving, right? What's really different about the lymphatic circulation compared to the blood circulation?
Not driven
Doesn't
by the
have the
heart.
heart.
There's no
Yeah.
heart.
Yeah.
There's no ultimate pump. It's starting from a blind alley and managing to get all the way back, right? There's nothing driving this. So how does the lymph actually make it?
Skeletal muscle.
Are there-
The same stuff we saw with veins, basically. One-way valve, massage by skeletal muscle, as well as actually they're often bundled next to arteries. So as the arteries are pulsing nearby, that actually is going to help drive the flow. But yeah, if you don't move much, you probably notice that your fingers get kind of fatter. You know, just if you're not moving, you're not helping drain that lymph, and you're more likely to end up getting a bit of like temporary kind of more edema.
Like on airplanes,
What's that?
on airplanes?
Yeah, on airplanes. On airplanes too, you have less venous circulation as well. That's, you know, it's not that uncommon for people to get up off of a plane and then drop dead, walk into the gate because they've been on the flight for 12 hours and blood kind of was pooling and you end up with a clot and then they get a pulmonary embolism as they kind of get up and everything starts flowing again. So yeah, if you're on a plane, you definitely want to do some little calisthenics or something. You don't want to just sit still for 12 hours. Yeah, one other thing I'll mention, since I talked about the lymph vessels having those little flaps that are to bring in larger things like, you know, larger proteins or even cells. Because you know the lymph cells, lymphocytes are going to be traveling through the lymph system and stuff like that. But if you have cancer, cancer cells can get into these lymph capillaries as well. So if somebody has cancer, what is cancer? It's just when you have cells that are proliferating uncontrollably, like any kind of cell that starts dividing when it shouldn't, starts growing into a tumor. And if it stays intact, it's just pushing on whatever's there and taking up your resources. But if it breaks free, you know, metastasizes, then one of those guys gets pulled along and now is free to start new little tumors in new places. So the lymphatic system is actually a way for metastasizing cancer to move around and find new places to set up camp. You know, so if they find a cancer, a tumor someplace, they'll often remove all the surrounding lymph nodes as well, because that's where it's likely set up new little tumors if that's happened. So in general, they'll remove the tumor, but also remove the surrounding lymph nodes in case the cancer cells have started creating little new tumors there.
This may be a stupid question, but can cancer cells move around in your blood too?
What's that?
Can they move around in your blood too?
I mean, by definition, leukemia are cancerous blood cells.
Stupid question, yeah.
It was
My
not a
dad had
stupid
blood
question.
cancer,
That's
but
not
it
a
was in
stupid
his
question.
bone marrow.
Right, but the bone marrow feeds into the blood.
Yeah.
You know, that's where I was talking about those. What do you call them? The sinusoidal capillaries in the marrow, because at the marrow is where you have all the hematopoietic tissue that's making the blood stuff, the blood cells, which then goes to the bloodstream. So cancer. Oh. Yeah, let's take a break. It's 10, let's come back at 10:30.